not here. So in class on Tuesday, before we left, you were all taking this survey about can you spot the research result? And if we can look at the results, we can see the green is actually the research, what the research says, and the gray is what is the thing that's maybe more obvious that we think we're going to do, but the research shows that the green is what the research says is the correct answer. So it shows that when teachers monitor the entire classroom, the achievement is higher rather than they attend to just the children in a small group. So when we look at this in general, you can see that the gray for many of them is longer than the green. Some of them, the green is longer. Maybe it's more obvious what the right answer was. But so the point to this is not what your score was, but what did you learn from doing this? So I'm going to send you into your breakout rooms and to take a couple minutes to talk to each other about what you learned by taking this survey and seeing what the research said after you responded what you thought the research said. So let's go into our breakout rooms. I just need to, I don't think I have my list here of who's in what room. I don't know if you remember who's in your breakout room, but let me just go grab the list from last. Okay, welcome back. We're just waiting for a couple more to join us. And then I'd like to hear from a couple of you about what you learned, what you talked about in your room, what you learned from doing this exercise. Let's see. Emily, can you tell us a little bit about what you were talking about in your room?
So we struggled finding like where we could find the answers at first, and then we just retook it. But we were surprised with a couple of them, like the one with the about the teachers monitoring like the entire classroom versus um, focusing on the small group. But then there were some that like I don't know, it made sense at least to me about using more manipulative tasks rather than like paper and pencil for learning.
Okay. All right, good. That makes sense. Thanks, Emily. How about room two? Kia, what were you talking about in your room?
So basically, all of us only got like half of them right, and we were all very surprised with the actual answers to them.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't talk about any of them specifically, but just
Yeah.
overall, just all thrown off.
Okay, good. I'm glad you mentioned that because that's the purpose for doing this, to show you that research isn't always what we think. We think we know facts. We think that we can just use our common sense. But then when we actually do research, we might find out the opposite or something different than what we believe to be true. Good, thank you. Let's look at room three. Zach, what did you talk about in your room? Anything different? Oops, I just lost Zach. Okay, what about Jada? What were you talking about in your room?
So I talked about like a specific question. I think it was regarding like second or third graders,
Mhm.
where they asked if the teachers maintain like an emotional climate. No, no, no. I think it was whether they emphasize attitudes more than they focus closely on like the academic teaching. And
Mhm.
I thought if they focus more on like, I believe the attitudes, it would be better only because I know younger students, they like don't really care for school as much. Like they like to play around and stuff. But if teachers focus more on their attitudes towards learning, that it would be better for them. But I believe it was the opposite regarding like the academic teaching.
Is this the one about maintain a warm climate or a business-like climate? Was that the one?
No, I think it was the one below it. I tried to remember my results. I believe,
Oh, the attitudes or
yeah, the
actual
attitude
teaching?
one.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. Yeah, I mean, you were surprised by that. It's not what you expected. And that's what happens with research is, we think we know something, we think it makes sense to us, and then we do the research, we look at the research, and sometimes the research isn't what we think. That's why this is called obvious versus research. Thank you. What about in room 4? Gia, what were you talking about in your room?
We were just talking about how it was like pretty much what everyone else was saying. The results were just very surprising because
Okay.
obviously some of them seemed like super, like there was some I feel like when I was looking, I spent a lot of time on the answers, like I didn't really know. And there was
Mhm.
ones I thought I immediately knew, and a lot of those were the ones I happened to get wrong.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. All right, great. What about, let's see, room 6. Hannah, what was your room talking about?
Yeah, our room was just talking about how when we were looking through, we got most of our answers were incorrect.
Okay.
And that when we were going back and looking again, we were kind of like, maybe if we thought about it a little bit more, we could have like gotten the right answer.
Okay. All right, that's fair thinking about that. And here's the thing about research is, we don't know what the answer is. We might think we have that, so we might have a hypothesis and we think something, and we go with our instincts, but maybe something else is true. Good. How about Viv? Viv, will you tell me what you were talking about in room 7?
We talked about how we were surprised by all the results and how it kind of like threw us all off. And then we like couldn't see our score, so that's kind of all we got into was like how like what we remembered was like that we thought our answers were sensible and then they apparently weren't.
Okay, good, good. Thank you, Hannah. Peter, what about you? What did you and Paige talk about?
Nothing that hasn't really been said already. We
Okay.
said that while we were taking it, just a lot of the answers seemed like they were going to be obvious,
Hmm.
but there's just a couple that were like striking when we got them wrong. Well,
Okay.
but then there's obviously some that were obvious to answer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we can see that when we look at the results here, we look and see some of them where, like this one must have been striking because most people said when children are called on in a random order, and it really was when children are called in a fixed order was the reading achievement was higher. So it's interesting, and each one of these is based on studies. So it is interesting to go into the study and find out more about why is that so. Like, for example, this one, students it's better when you call on students in a fixed order because when it's a random order, they're just so worried about when are you going to call on me that they don't focus on their learning. Whereas if they know when they're going to get called on, then they can relax and pay attention to the lesson. So that makes sense when you think about it. But like a couple of you said, at first you think one answer is obvious, but once you dive into it, you might find out differently. So good. Well, thanks for that conversation. And let's get into just talking a bit about empirical research. In the chat, would you just put in how many of you put yes or no if you've taken any research classes already? Okay. So I see mostly no's, but a few yeses. That gives me good information as to how detailed I need to go in about this. So empirical research is what we do when we want to find out what works, especially in the educational psychology world. We want to find out because we can have a gut feeling, but we really need to know what works. And how do we know what works? If we're a school district and we're going to spend millions of dollars on a new reading program, we need to know if it works. If we're going to try a new strategy in our classroom, we need to know what works. Because are we going to spend the time, the money, etc., on something if we don't know if it works? So we do empirical research to find out what works. But there's different kinds of empirical research. We have qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative research is the research we do to find out, to really understand something at a deeper level. Much of the education research is qualitative because a lot of the research questions at this level are more looking at student understanding and maybe attitudes and things that you can't just quantify easily. And if we can't quantify them easily, then we're going to collect information like interview people, like ask people open-ended questions, those kind of things where the data is actually words. We're going to like dig into understanding something by talking to people, by finding out what people think, what people believe, and things like that. That's qualitative research when we are doing that. Quantitative research is when we're going to collect data that we can count, like student achievement. Do you get a better test grade when I do this? Do students' achievement scores rise when we have a different class size? There's different things that we can, experiment on and find out what affects student achievement or maybe what affects motivation. If we do this, will motivation increase or decrease? But we would have to measure motivation in a quantitative way for it to be quantitative research. We could also look at motivation and ask questions based on, giving us answers and not just a number like a Likert scale, and that would be qualitative. So in the world of qualitative, you see all of the words here, and quantitative is the numbers. So if we're going to conduct some quantitative research, this is going to be very objective. We're going to stand back, observe, measure, and when we collect information about a small sample, we can then generalize and make an inference about a larger population. So if let's say I do an experiment and I'm using 2 classes of 3rd graders, I can then maybe infer that other 3rd graders in the school district might have the same responses. So that's what we're going to do in quantitative is we're going to be objective, we're going to collect data that's numbers, and we're going to try to generalize to a larger population and say, this indicates that others might have the same types of answers. A goal of qualitative research is to describe and to analyze things like behavior. So we're going to be looking at student behavior or teacher behavior or parent behavior or something. We're going to describe it and analyze it. We might look at people's subjective states, like their emotional states, and what the meaning that they give them. So we're going to have to talk to people to do that. And we can't generalize to large populations with qualitative, but we can transfer to other similar situations. So if I do some qualitative research and you read my research and you're teaching something similar or you have similar students, then you can transfer the results to your situation. But we can't generalize to large populations and say, whole groups of 3rd graders would respond this way. So empirical research is both quantitative and qualitative. Some people think it's just quantitative, but in order to make it empirical so that we can publish it and be in a peer-reviewed journal, and that way it's kind of the stamp of approval that this is adding to the pool of knowledge of what we know, there has to be some way to systematically collect the data and then a rigorous analysis of the data. So some kind of system or process that we're analyzing the data. With quantitative data, it's usually a statistical test. With qualitative data, we're going to code and we're going to put things in categories and we're going to summarize. But there's certain systems things that we do to analyze the data. In order for it to be empirical research, we need it to be able to be replicated. So someone else can take our study and replicate the study and see if they get the similar results. So we have to give enough information to other researchers so they can replicate the study. And it needs to be peer reviewed so that other peers who can look at this research, read it and say, yes, okay, this is legitimate research and this is worthy of being published in a journal. So let's look a little bit deeper into quantitative research types. So one kind of quantitative research that we can do is a true experiment. And this is where we have a random assignment to groups. We have a treatment group and we have a control group. The treatment group gets the treatment. So let's say I'm going to use praise and see if praise makes a difference on student achievement. The treatment group would get the praise and the control group would not get the praise. But I would have to randomly assign students to the different groups. By doing a true experiment, then we can say this causes that. We can look at cause and effect relationships. If it's not true experiment, we can't really say there's a cause and effect. So this is an experimental study. A quasi-experimental study is when we don't randomly assign students to the group. And most educational research is quasi-experimental because researchers can't just come into a school and say, we want these students in this class and these students in that class randomly. We have to just go with the classes that already exist. So this is called a convenience sample. And in education, most of the time it is a convenience sample. And that's a non-random assignment. So we have to call it quasi-experimental. It's not true experimental, but we can still treat it like quantitative research and we can still generalize to a larger population. There's also single subject studies where we want to look at the effect of a teaching method or therapy or an intervention. So we're having trouble with a specific student and their behavior. Then we might collect data on their behavior in the baseline. Then we might give them praise and see if praise works and how often that, see, this is the frequency of disruptions. So notice that disruptions go down with praise. And then when you stop giving praise, see what happens and the disruptions go back up. So this kind of shows us that the praise did help the student with decreasing the frequency of disruptions. So that's the purpose of single subject study. In this case, we won't be able to generalize to large populations, but we can do some transferring there and say, hey, if I have a student who's disruptive in my class, I might want to use praise as well. There's also something called a correlation study, and that is when we're examining relationships, not relationships between people, but relationships between variables. Okay, so we're looking to see, what's the relationship between X and Y? When one goes up, does the other go up or does it go down? So we look at the direction of the relationship. If it's positive, one variable will increase while the other one decreases. If it's negative, as one increases, the other increases. So it goes the opposite. If they both go in the same direction, it's a positive correlation. If they go in different directions, it's a negative correlation. And we also look in a correlation to see if the relationship is either a strong relationship or a weak relationship. So if it's a weak relationship, we might say it has a correlation of, say, 0.25 or something. But as we move closer to -1 and +1, it's a stronger relationship, and we can be more confident that those two things are just strongly related. When one goes up, the other goes up, or when one goes up, the other goes down. So those are some of the main kinds of quantitative research. With qualitative research types, we have something like, this is ethnographies. And in an ethnography, we study a culture. This isn't just like a culture when you think of going to another country and studying their culture. It might be the culture of a school building or the culture of a classroom. But looking at to see how do people behave, what are the norms in this culture. We can also conduct a case study that's a qualitative study, and we want to describe or interpret something like a program or an event where we're going to look specifically into a specific thing and look for it. Might be looking at a certain kind of treatment that we're giving to patients or students. Then there's phenomenological studies, which is just a fancy word for interviews. And the purpose for this is to just really get to the nitty-gritty and talk to someone or a bunch of people about their experience and what they interpret as the meanings for their experience. And then we have something called a discourse or a document analysis. And this is when we look into either we listen to or read conversations that have been transcribed, or we look at documents and we analyze them and we look for patterns or themes within that written work. So that's just a quick little summary of different kinds of empirical research. So let's play a Kahoot game and just go over and check for your understanding. All right, I hope that by just taking a few minutes to play that game, we can kind of reinforce what I mentioned earlier. So you know a little bit more about research, empirical research, and this is also going to help you on the quiz that you take later. So let's go back to the presentation here. So what? We have this research. Why go and read the research? I'm a teacher. I know my subject area. I know what I'm teaching. Why do I need to read research? Well, one reason is that common sense is not always correct. Like you noticed when you did that assignment on Tuesday, that sometimes we think this is what the answer is, but when we read the research, really it's something different. We also need to read the research when we're making decisions, like in a school district, on what we should spend our time and money on. And that there's research-based strategies. So a lot of you asked the question last week of, why don't teachers all know about this? Why don't teachers teach these things in their classrooms? There are research-based strategies, but teachers don't always read the research. They're busy with their lives doing other things. So those are the reasons that we need to read research and be aware of research. So in your classes over the next few years and in your graduate programs, you know, you'll hopefully understand why we need research and why we need to really pay attention to what the research is. So let's see, what time is it here? 10:11. We're doing good. We have one activity left today, and that is we're going to go through types of thinking. So we're starting to think about now cognitive development and how we think. And what I'd like to do is share with you this theory that my colleagues and I have been working on for many years. I started thinking about this theory when I was teaching second grade, and that was probably about, I don't know, 40 years ago. I was teaching second grade, and I had a student, George. He was a delightful little guy, and he was so creative. He thought of all these ideas. No matter what I said, he came up with an unusual idea that no one else would think of. At the time, I was in my master's program for creative thinking at Buffalo State College, and I really was appreciating George's thinking. But it was a problem because sometimes I needed him to do other kinds of thinking other than creative thinking. Sometimes I needed him to remember what I taught yesterday, or I needed him to use his reasoning and his logical thinking. So that's when I came up with this idea of, you know, there's literal thinking, and I called that red light thinking, and creative thinking, which was green light thinking. At the time, I wasn't even thinking of interpret at the time, but it was like, okay, George, now I want you to remember. That's literal thinking. I want you to remember what you learned. Okay, now it's green light. You can think of whatever you want. Whatever you say is okay. I want you to be creative and come up with your own ideas. And then I was able to communicate to my class, both it's red light thinking. So everyone, I want you to remember, how do you spell this word? What's 2 + 2? Whatever it is I was teaching them. Oh, now it's green light thinking. I want you to make something up. I want you to be different than everyone else. So that really helped communicate to my students what kind of thinking I was asking them to do. And a year later, I went to some training with something called Junior Great Books, where we were learning how to help children interpret ambiguous kinds of text. And I realized that that's kind of in between creative and literal thinking. Interpretive thinking is kind of like, you can't just say anything. So it's not like creative thinking where anything goes, but it's beyond literal thinking where you're not just remembering. You have to use your reasoning and your logic to take what you're learning and then take it to the next level. And this went along with other things that I was learning about teaching in my beginning of my career with higher level thinking. And it was interesting because as I was teaching this to students in all different grade levels, I had little first graders say, hey, that literal thinking is what you think about. Without it, you wouldn't have anything to think about. So I thought that was pretty brilliant of a little first grader, but it's true. So literal thinking is foundational. It's not really lower level thinking, but it's the thing that the other kinds of thinking stand on. Your creative thinking is based on, taking what you know and then taking it somewhere else where no one else might take it and coming up with a new idea. Your literal thinking then can also be enhanced by using your logical thinking to say, oh, well, I think about this. And so the notice, think, wonder strategy comes into place here, because when you're thinking about something, you take what you notice and you think about it, you're using your interpretive thinking. Or you're wondering about it, you might be using your interpretive or your creative thinking. So literal thinking is remembering. It's this foundational, it's the facts and the information that you're learning about. Interpretive thinking is taking those facts and information and bringing it to the next level by using your logic, by figuring something out, by making connections, by building a big picture. That would be interpretive thinking. And creative thinking is when you generate ideas or you take something apart and put it together in new ways, and you're looking for something that's useful. That's creative thinking. So now we're going to do this activity and we're going to play around with the different kinds of thinking to help you understand the difference between them. So first, I want you to just brainstorm questions about this object. So in the chat, I want you to write whatever questions come into your head. When I say brainstorm, I mean use your creative thinking. So there's no wrong questions about this object, whatever you want. But look and see what other people are asking so we don't have just 10 of the same question. Now, the reason we're doing this is the thing about, remember I was telling you about George. I would ask George something and sometimes he would give me a creative answer, but I really was asking him a literal question. So it's really important that I communicate to my students what kind of question did I intend, what kind of thinking did I intend you to use so that you can give me an appropriate response. But not everyone will interpret it the same way. So what I want to do now is we're going to take some of your questions and we're going to try to figure out whether the question is going to elicit creative, interpretive, or literal responses. And this process is interpretive. Not everyone's going to agree, so we're going to have some conversations about it. So let's look at this. So remember, a literal question is something that we want to remember or research the correct answer. An interpretive question is when we're going to figure out the answer using our reasoning. And a creative question means we can make up an answer and try to be original. So why did someone invent this? Here's a question. Do you think that this question, if I ask this question to the group, why did someone invent this? Are you going to use your literal thinking to remember or research the correct answer? Are you going to use your interpretive question to figure out the answer using your reasoning? or are you going to make up an answer and be original? So in the chat, I want you to put L, I, or C, literal, interpretive, or creative. Okay, the kind of thinking I'm asking you to do now is interpretive thinking, because there isn't just one right answer. What depends on your answer being a good answer or not is your reasoning behind why you chose that. So I'm going to ask Peter, Peter, you chose interpretive. Why did you choose interpretive for this question?
Well, there's definitely a reason somebody invented this.
Okay.
I have no idea what it is. It could be difficult to figure out. You could try to be creative, but there is an answer, so it's interpretive.
Okay. So what you just said is there is a reason, so that's why you were thinking, because why is asking a reason. But if there is a specific answer to this, that would be a literal question. That why did someone invent this? There is an answer. What you're saying to me is there is an answer to this question. We just don't know what it is. So that would be a literal question then, in that case, for what you're thinking. But if you say, why did someone invent this? And you started to reason and make up, well, I think someone invented this because, and you gave me a reason for why they invented this, then that would be you using your interpretive thinking. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Let's look at, let me ask Carly. Carly, you said,
Well, I kind of like same with Peter, like I kind of just think there's a answer, like a correct answer. So I would just research the um like this and I would try to find the correct answer kind of online or something or through a book.
all right. So that makes sense. That's why this could be a literal question, but it also could be interpretive question. Like a few of you said, it could be interpretive. And Peter even mentioned it could be creative because we could just make something up and say, oh, I could use it for this. And someone said, is it something to do with the dog? I could use it for digging, or I could use it for whatever. And you could be creative with this. Say, why did someone invent this in order to dig a hole, in order to whatever? You could make something up and you could be creative with this question. So if I were asking this question to my second graders, I would want to be very clear with them and say, I'm asking you, why did someone invent this? We learned about it yesterday. Can you remember? Or I want you to be creative. Why do you think someone might have invented this? What could you use it for? And then I'm encouraging them to use their creative thinking. So it's a way that I can communicate with my students and they can communicate with me about what kind of thinking they're using. Let's try another question. We just talked about what this could be used for. What is the name of this object? What do you think that's literal, interpretive, or creative? Okay, so let's hear from a couple. Quinn, you said creative, so why did you say creative?
Well, you can name it whatever you want. So I figured it's more creative if like let's just say you made it, you can name it like whatever you want instead of like going by like a set of rules.
Okay, good. That's a good reason for saying this could be a creative question. I can say, what do you name this object? And I could give everyone, the chance. But if I told you this is a creative question, then you could have fun with it and really, name it anything. So it could be a creative question. Paige, you said interpretive. Tell me why you think it was interpretive.
Um, just by looking at it, I feel like you could probably figure out what it's called just by like trying to figure out what it does or even like how it looks. Like it has like the little circle and like it looks like maybe that could be a handle or something like that. So you could
Okay.
just like look at it and kind of deduce what the name of it is just by trying to figure out exactly what it does.
Okay, perfect. That was such a good answer for why it might be interpretive, because you're using deduction. You're looking and saying, oh, it's got this. It looks like maybe a ring, maybe the name of it's a ring, or maybe you can kind of use your logical thinking to figure out what could be the name of this. All right, let's see. Bosco, you said literal. Why do you think literal?
Oh, because I think it's literal because I feel like there's no way you'd be able to like somehow guess or f think your way to the answer. I just feel
Mhm.
like you'd have to browse the web to try to figure out what the object is called.
Okay, that was a good reason for why this could be literal. So you can see that I have this one question here. To some of you, it's obviously a literal question. To some of you, you say, oh, this is an interpretive question, and some think it's creative. So do you see how it's very easy in a classroom for students to answer in a way that's different from what the teacher intended? So my colleagues and I started teaching this to other teachers and started sharing it with our classes. And remember, you took the Thinking Styles Preference Survey earlier in the semester, and that helped get into this conversation. But after this, we were able to tell students we want this kind of thinking. My friend who is an English high school teacher used to put a colored dot next to questions on a test to let students know, here, I want you to remember, here, I want you to be interpretive, here, I want you to be creative. And we were able to then communicate with our students and let them know the kind of thinking that we want them to do. So this is why we taught them this. So, and we look at the noticing, thinking, and wondering, we have, noticing is the literal thinking, to notice the details. And then when we're interpreting things, we might be thinking or wondering using our interpretive thinking, or we might be using our creative thinking and our curiosity. Wait, go back. I don't want to go all the way. So I want to share with you what this actually is. This is called an archer's thumb ring, and see how it's used to pull back on the for the bow here. So now you know what it is. But I wanted to go through that process so that you can see that knowing what type of thinking that is necessary is going to really help you know what kind of response I'm looking for. So throughout the class, throughout the next lessons, sometimes I'm going to let you know, hey, I want you to use your creative thinking, or hey, I want you to use your interpretive thinking, or this is going to be literal thinking. In fact, the final exam is going to be organized by the different types of thinking. So that's why I wanted to go through it now, because we're going to be referring to it over the next few weeks. So what else you have to do this week is return to UB Learns for the blog entry. So you have a blog for week 3 about why you think research is needed about learning, and whose responsibility do you think it is to teach students how to learn. So as we're talking about this, so just your opinion about those two things, I'm asking you to use your interpretive thinking here. And then Carly had a really good question about blog buddies. You have your blog buddies that are the same of people that were in your group for when we go into breakout rooms. And you might have several people in your room. The purpose for blog buddies is for you to have an audience for your blog. So I'm asking you to read all of your blog buddies' posts. However, you don't have to answer every single post. I don't want it to be fake. I'm not going to monitor this. I want you to have an audience, and I want you to be able to connect with each other, but I don't want it to be fake. So if you connect with that person, what they said, and you have something to say back, then reply to that person. Okay. You don't have to necessarily reply to every single person in your group. You may end up connecting with a couple of people, or just each week you might connect with a different person, but make a response and reply to anyone in your group whose blog you read and you think, I have something to say to this. I have a connection. I want to say something. I want to be a cheerleader for this person, or whatever you'd like to do. So please do that for week 2 if you haven't already done so. And then write in week 3. Then you have your chapter 1 quiz. It covers the material of chapter 1 in the textbook. So you should make sure you read those pages in the chapter. So if you look in Google Classroom, it tells you for your reading assignment, you're not reading the whole chapter, you're just reading these pages. Okay? Page 9, what makes a teacher, 3 teachers effective. So it tells you which pages to read. You don't have to read all of the whole page. If for some reason you don't have the textbook, I have attached chapter 1. I'm not going to do this in the future, but there is chapter 1 from the textbook here if you need it. So you'll be able to take the quiz. But you can go to UB Learns, the UB bookstore, and grab the book, or get it ordered quickly because you're going to be reading chapters 2 the next week, and you're going to need your textbook. Okay, so one more thing that I want to tell you before we go is on Tuesday, we're going to be learning about memory flashing and mind mapping. So bring colored pencils or markers or crayons or something colorful to write with, and some blank paper to class with you. All right, that's it for our lesson for today. I'm going to hang out here if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to talk to me about. Otherwise, have a great weekend, and I'll see you Tuesday morning.